Welcome everybody to today's lecture in cognitive psychology. Some of you may have noticed, if you looked up the lecture from last week on YouTube, that it looked quite different to what we did last week. The reason is that last week's recordings went totally wrong. So I had two camcorders, both didn't record any proper sound. We had the Brunel system, again not working, not recording any sound. So 3 recordings were all going wrong. So this week I'm going traditional and have a cabled connection. So hopefully I don't fall, stumble or anything here. So that hopefully this week's recording will be better. So what you see on YouTube is the lecture from last year. So it's not identical to this year, but it will give you pretty much the same overview and idea of things we discussed. Okay, so cognitive psychology, and this week we talk about perception, as you have probably seen. So our schedule for today is that we have a brief introduction to perception. We very briefly speak about the physiology, because I think you have covered that in other lectures. And then we go through some, I didn't update that, we skipped that part, psychophysics, which we briefly touched upon last week. And then we have some nice examples from the Gestalt theory, depth perception, and how do we recognize objects like a cup or things like that. How does our cognitive system do that? Okay, let's start with an introduction into the topic of perception. Let's start with the definition. That's always a good idea to start with, and then to elaborate a little bit on that. One definition of perception is that perception is actually the process by which our cognitive system constructs an internal representation of the outside world. So we will speak about that in a bit more detail, what all that actually means. Perception, the topic of perception, has been, in a sense, picked up in a couple of Hollywood movies. The first one, probably The Matrix, nowadays already quite old, from 1999. And most of you probably have seen that movie. The actors or the people in that movie live kind of in a computer-generated world. They have implanted something into their head, into their brain, which kinds of mimics the sensory impressions they would get by living in such a world. And then, of course, we have our hero who managed to escape. Another example, maybe not that well known, is the movie Surrogates with Bruce Willis, from 2009, and here the people kind of in some future voluntarily go into some state, so they sit in this comfortable chair, and then I think they have like robots running around controlled by them, just by their thoughts, and they pick up the sensory impressions of them. So these examples illustrate something, and that is that perception is not necessarily the exact picture or representation of the outside world, but instead it's our personal experience of what our senses pick up. And that doesn't necessarily need to be an exact copy of what happens outside. In both examples, the protagonists just sit in their chairs or in some thing and don't actually move, don't experience anything. They just have like an computer simulated outside world. And you can see that we go slightly into that direction. We get now these virtual reality goggles, which really becoming good now. So there is something to that. So the key issues we focus on when we talk about perception is that perception is not an accurate representation of the reality. It's an interpretation of our senses. And our senses may actually be fooled. So they may deceive us, like in the extreme example, we just go into some virtual reality environment. And the question associated with that is, of course, whether the errors which our sensory system make, whether they can be corrected or not. So from a psychologist's point of view, are things like the matrix or surrogates possible? So directly speaking from a psychology point of view, without considering technical advances also, in principle, yes. So if it is possible to stimulate our senses to such a good detail, such an accurate detail, high quality, that we can't distinguish whether it's simulated or the real thing, then we could be sitting in some weird chair and thinking we stand here in a lecture theater and giving a lecture. So, of course, at the moment that's probably not possible. It's just about the principle thing. Okay, so turning back to the definition we spoke about. So perception is the process by which the cognitive system constructs an internal representation of the outside world. So two important things here. Constructs means it is an active process. So our mind is really doing something with the input. It's not like a photograph, passively perceiving all the light waves, and that's how reality looked like. And representation means that it may be different to reality. It represents reality in some way, but maybe not in the 100% accurate way. So actually, you could say that perception is a little bit like an artist's painting. So this person interprets what he sees. Maybe makes a tree a little bit greener because the light is like that today. And maybe says, okay, this is such a nice tree, I make it a bit more prominent for some reason, so that it's more eye-catching. And he actually actively constructs it. So, what do we perceive with? That's a pretty basic question. With our senses. That's all we have. So, how many senses do we have? Just shout out some guesses you may have. 5. Anybody? Different opinions? Okay, all 5. No, there are more senses. So here we have 8 senses, and there may be even more. So most of us know, of course, vision with our eyes, audition with our ears, taste with the tongue, smell with the nose, touch with the skin. However, we have which is called equilibrioception in our ear, so that we can sense gravity. With our ear, or the organs in our ear, we can sense whether we are upright or whether we are laying down. So that's the reason why you get often, for instance, seasick, because your sense of vision, the feedback from the eye that your surrounding is stable and not moving, and your sense of equilibrium perception gives you different inputs. Here you have movement on a ship, and here you say it's stable. We don't move. And that difference makes you seasick. Thermoception, sense of temperature. Nociception, sense of pain. We have sensors which tell us exactly how our muscles are tense, how our joints are positioned, things like that. So we have a lot of internal senses as well about things. And each sensor or each sensory modality is specific to some physical attribute of physical stimulus. So in vision, light is actually electromagnetic waves in a certain frequency range. You know that we can't see infrared light, for instance. Same for audition. We have waves of air pressure or air vibrations, you may say. And you know that we have a certain cutoff. So only few people can hear very slightly, for instance, the noises made by bats when they hunt or things like that. Taste and smell is chemical substances, basically. Touch is pressure on the skin. Balance, detection of gravity, things like that. Okay, so there are a lot of senses and sensors we have to get an idea of our external environment and our internal environment. Okay, any questions about that brief introduction? Okay, so let's very quickly go through the physiology, and I just want to reiterate probably some of the key principles we have in the perception, and we will have the example of vision here. So it all starts that we have a physical stimulus, like light, must somehow meet the sensor, the receptor. In this case, it's the retina in the eye. And on the retina, we have certain nerve cells or types of cells which somehow transform the physical stimulus into neural activity. And how that happens, of course, is different for every sensory modality. So, for instance, the rods and cones, these sensors on the retina, are sensitive to photons. So when a photon comes in here, chemical reactions happen which finally result in an action potential. If you have the sense of touch, then you have differently shaped receptors which, when squeezed together, release chemical substances which then result in an action potential, and so forth. So you have some specific type of cell which transforms the physical stimulus into a neural activity. That's the crucial point here, which happens. Now, what happens to this neural activity? It has to be processed, and therefore it has to travel to the neocortex. And again, very quickly with the eye, you know that we have these tracks which then go into the primary visual cortex, which are at the back of the brain. In the visual cortex, we have a very nice and ordered organization which you can see and follow even with rather broad measures such as fMRI or something. You can really see, okay, which area of the eye or in my visual field have I stimulated, and then it's orderly organized here in the cortex. In our brain, we have specified areas to process each sensory modality. So as I said, visual area, occipital lobe in the back of the brain, somatosensory cortex, that means touch, and also proprioception, that means how our muscles and joints are positioned, are more here in the central lines, directly behind the central sulcus. We have the auditory cortex, which is on the top of the temporal lobes, rather here, roughly here. And it sounds a little bit weird that our ear and the auditory cortex seems to be so close to each other, but remember, the right ear is processed in the left hemisphere and the left and right hemisphere, so it still has to travel quite a bit. We have olfactory cortex and so forth. So we have a separation of information, and here all the sensory information is processed then. And one important characteristic here is that the processing is hierarchically organized. So again, in terms of the visual cortex, we have primary visual cortex, V1, and then we have secondary cortices like V2, V3, so forth. And each area makes the information more abstract. So in the primary visual cortex, what we do is basically detect edges. So for every point in our visual field, we see, okay, it's an edge of that angle or of that angle or of that angle. It's really smoothly organized along the cortex to see for every, and they light up. In higher areas, we are able to detect and recognize more difficult percepts. So in this example, this is a so-called Canisa figure. Most people see a square in front of 4 discs. And if you see the square, then somehow you have an illusory contour, so which goes here. So on the primary visual cortex, when you look at these places where you look, then you don't have activity. At higher cortices, you actually have, for neurons which encode edges at this point, you have some activity. So that is explained why you see an illusory contour here. Because you see, oh, there's a whole shape, there's a square, so there must be a line. So that activates that. And it goes higher and higher, becomes more and more complex, until this is a view from the bottom of the brain, so to say. So we look here below our left temporal cortex here, so that you have areas which are really specialized for recognizing complex things like faces in the fusiform face area, or places or houses and things like that in the parahippocampal place area. So this, you don't need to know that for this lecture in detail. This is just to give you a rough idea of how the sensory system is organized. And so far, we have seen how the processing goes. It comes from light to eye to retina to rods and cones, the receptors, neural activity and the brain, and then it becomes more and more complex in the brain. This is called bottom-up processing. So everything is determined from the bottom, from the lowest level, the raw stimulus, the raw signal from the retina, and then it becomes more and more complex. So you could say we have this bottom-up processing, and that feeds into perception until finally we recognize that is a face or something like that. However, we also know that high-level knowledge can influence our perception. So there seems to be something, or knowledge. So when you read that, these two words, most people will immediately read the cat, and will have no problems reading that as an H and that as an A. Although from their physical properties, both stimuli are identical. So it must be previous knowledge about the form of words and which letter to expect in a word, which forms our perception here. So we have so-called top-down knowledge or top-down influences here as well. And that is not natural. I have a 5-year-old daughter which just learns how to write and read, and I think they have now 20 letters in school and didn't do every letter. I guess for her it would be a pretty big problem, and she may sometimes read that as an H and sometimes as an A, totally in a totally random fashion. So when we have such top-down influences, then we need to take care of that in product design, for instance. And you know that maybe from last week. I don't know whether all people have been here, so we go through that quickly. Most people would say, okay, that is a traffic sign for caution, there are roadworks and this guy shoveling something away. However, when you suddenly get this additional higher level knowledge that it's a man struggling with an umbrella, your percept might change. So when you design a sign or something, you have to take care that really the vast majority of people actually sees the same thing, and not maybe people from a different cultural background suddenly see something different because they have a stronger association with something else here. So as I said, this is called top-down processing. So higher level, in this neurological terms, it's higher level brain areas like the prefrontal cortex or superior parietal cortex, which influence the neural processing in lower areas. So there's feeding back. So the more complete picture of how perception works is that it's affected by both, by bottom-up, the information coming from the sensors, and by top-down modulation. And this is an interactive process. So information is coming up, and the first sketches of processing, when there's not really totally thorough processing, are evaluated by these brain areas, and they immediately feed back to modulate processing in these lower areas, so that it's like a back and forth until you finally stabilized on one interpretation of the input, so that you have one stable percept. Because what you don't want to have is a percept which all the time changes back and forth, back and forth. Go back to this example of the cat. How annoying it would be if it all the time flickers between H and A. Your perceptual system decides on one interpretation, and usually it stays with that, even if it's the wrong one. Okay. So, to summarize that, we said we start out with the receptor, and we had the example of vision, but the same principles apply to all our sensory modalities. From receptor to neural activity, activation of the respective sensory areas in the brain. Then in the neocortex, we have a processing of that information which is highly organized. As we have seen, we have different areas in the visual system which process color, a different area for shape, a different area for depth perception, and so forth. We have hierarchical processing, so from very simple, like detecting edges, to more complex, like faces. And we have seen that we have top-down influences, so that our expectations, previous knowledge, the context of information can influence our perception of things. Okay, do you have any questions regarding this physiology part? Okay, then we go back to what we briefly covered last week, and that is the domain of psychophysics. These are some very old instruments from an old laboratory, and don't ask me what exactly they are doing, but you must consider when we speak about the stuff we are seeing now, that many of these experiments have been done like 1890 or something, 1850. And at these times they didn't have computers to record responses in a millisecond accuracy or something, although you sometimes need that. They didn't have the facilities to control how many photons have been emitted or something. So they had to circumvent that with some bigger technology, let's say. Okay, let's start out with a very simple demonstration. If you look at this black cross and fixate here for a moment, and you wait 1 or 2 seconds, what would you say? Which square is brighter? And even if you know the answer or suspect it or anything, I would still like you to do that exercise quickly. Okay, somebody said the left square is brighter. Who shares that opinion? Who thinks the right square is brighter? Okay, most people, yeah. And in reality, of course, as you may think, both squares have the identical brightness. However, our perceptual system lets us appear, at least for most people, that this one is brighter. The reason is the context. Because the background is darker, the relative contrast is stronger here, so that we perceive it as brighter. And this is just aimed to illustrate how our perceptual system actually deceives us. It's not giving us an accurate representation of our surrounding. And I mean, from our everyday life, that usually doesn't really matter much, because usually we don't need to know that exact shades, differences, whether it's the same or not. However, it is important, for instance, for professionals who work in photography. When you work there, you really need screens which are calibrated so that they show you exact colors. They even have to take care about the ceiling lights. At what light temperature do they work? How does that interact with my screen? Because otherwise, you have a picture which is beautiful on the screen, and then you have it printed out, and you think, what's that? That's not what I saw on the screen. And I'm a little bit interested in photography, and I'm sometimes in internet forums, and there's quite a frequent complaint. Everybody told me that digital camera is so great, but it always makes pictures which are too dark. And people say, well, is your screen calibrated? Try on a different computer. And they say, oh, now they are looking right. So this is a very complicated issue, and besides technical things, we have to consider our perceptual system in that. So both squares are identical, and yeah, perception does not mirror reality, it distorts it. Well, that's maybe a little bit strong. It's not designed to always fool us or something. It's more in the sense of, well, sometimes it can be fooled and may be inaccurate. Now, the area of psychophysics, as we spoke about last week, is now how does perception actually capture reality on a very low level of things. So it's the relationship between physical stimuli and their perception, our personal perception of things. And there are three central questions in this area. The question of absolute threshold or detection threshold. How strong must the stimulus be so that I can detect it in the first place? The relative threshold. What is the difference between two stimuli to just notice the difference? And scaling. If I increase the physical intensity, how does my perceived intensity change? Now let's go through all these three and have some examples of that. So the detection threshold, some of you may know that and have experienced that for themselves. What is the minimum strength of a physical stimulation so that we notice its presence? And sometimes you have to do these tests, especially in the elderly. If they need a hearing aid or something, then they have to do like, okay, there are beeps, and did you hear something or didn't you hear something like that. Or you present very soft visual stimuli like dots or somewhere, and you ask people to always press a button when they detected something. Of course, we have a practical problem here, because when we work at extremely low thresholds, which are just at the border of being able to be detected, then stimuli, the same stimulus, is sometimes detected and sometimes not. Because we have some natural noise in our systems as well. We have effects of attention as well. Maybe we just paid attention to that spot in our visual field where it's detected, and the next moment we didn't, or something. So an alternative definition of a detection threshold is sometimes that it's the intensity at which 50% of the stimuli are detected. So we account for this baseline noise we have in our systems and these effects. And that's a definition. So that means sometimes even lower stimuli may be detected. So yeah, as I said, this threshold is affected by motivation, expectation, attention, adaptation, things like that. Okay, just to give you one example, this is a graph of the absolute auditory threshold for its mean graphs. Of course, every individual has different graphs here. And here on the y-axis we see the sound pressure. That means the higher, the louder the stimulus in physical properties, decibel. And here we have the frequency of the tone. So it's just a beep participants have to detect. And the different curves are for different age groups. And I want to illustrate something with that graph, and that is that usually we don't have one single threshold. First, the threshold is an individual measure, and secondly, even in the same person at the same time, it may depend, in this example, on the frequency of the auditory stimulus, of the tone. So people are most sensitive around 2000 Hertz in this area, and then become less sensitive for higher frequencies. Do you know roughly what that domain is? Which signal is mostly in that domain? Why are we most sensitive here?
Maybe our speech.
Yeah. So because that's one of the most important signals in our environment, speech. So we are somewhat tuned to that area. And you can see that this is for a 20-year-old, 30-year, 40, and so forth. So we lose sensitivity with age And everybody who meets their grandparents frequently will know, or most people will notice that it declines with age. So we have a number of factors here. If you work, another factor is adaptation. So many of you will know that if you have been in a club or on a concert or something where there has been loud music, afterwards you're nearly deaf. So especially when you're next to the speaker. So you need some time to come down. And even in our normal environment. In the visual system, for instance, people sometimes have to sit up to 15-20 minutes in complete darkness to make you most sensible, so that your sensors are fresh again, so to say, that all effects of previous light are worn out. Come on. Okay. Okay, so we spoke about the absolute threshold. Now the relative threshold, or it's also called sometimes just noticeable difference, before we turn to scaling. So the relative threshold describes the smallest detectable difference between two stimuli. So if you present two lights to you and I ask you which one is brighter, and if you can answer that, then you're above your just noticeable difference, and if you can't answer that, then you're below that. Okay, so we have seen Ernst Weber last week. He did quite a bit of work on that and was the first one to describe a law associated with that, and this is called, therefore, the Weber law. And this is the formula, luckily not very complex, so even if you're a psychologist, then this should be manageable. So most people fear statistics or mathematics. You don't need to know formulas or anything in the exam or so. So you don't need to learn that. So, and I stands for the intensity of the stimulus, and this is the difference in intensity of a second stimulus. And this is a constant. And what that basically means is that as an approximation, the just noticeable difference is proportional to the absolute intensity. So last week I had the example of a weight. If you have two very low weights, you are able to detect a smaller difference as compared when you have heavier weights. Then the smallest detectable difference is quite a bit bigger. So it increases with that. Same with light. To detect a difference between two lights, it's much more difficult when you have very bright lights as compared to very soft lights. Same for auditory things. There's an application for that idea in marketing, and this is now extending the view beyond our perception, let's say, of physical properties. But suppose you want to do negative changes to a product. So for instance, you want to reduce the content or increase the price of something. Then it's a good idea to stay below the just noticeable difference. So you could ask some people into your lab or testing facility in your company and say, well, these are our products, you may know them, that's the price. Is that the usual price or not? And people may say, well, yeah, it's a usual price because it just increased by 5p or something. However, if you increase it by £1, they may say, no, I don't think so. I think it's more expensive than usual. So if you want to do negative changes to your product, try to stay below the threshold that people detect that. They don't notice the change. However, on the opposite, if you want to do positive changes, make sure that you are above the threshold. Because if customers do not notice that you improved something, well, it was in vain. At the same time, if you are way beyond the J and D, then you may have improved to more than you needed to make a good impression to the customer and may have spent too much money. So this concept of just noticeable difference can be transferred to things like marketing or to things like product design. think about, for instance, a car. You have to make sure that the braking lights are strong enough in difference to the normal rear lights, so that when you drive in dark, you can see, oh, this person is actually braking or not. I find that sometimes difficult, for instance, in the US, where the blinker, the turning indicator, often is red as well as the rear light. If you're not used to that, that's sometimes hard to notice, actually. Okay, so we spoke about the absolute threshold. Now we spoke about the relative threshold, spoke about Weber's law. And now the last thing on psychophysics is scaling. And scaling asks, how does the perceived intensity, so what we perceive and think, how we experience is, with the change of the physical attributes of a stimulus? Or some people say, how much does the physical stimulus needs to perceive a doubled intensity? So that I say, okay, this light is twice as bright. How is the relationship with respect to the physical properties? And this relationship is virtually never linear. So to perceive a light which is twice as bright, you need a light which is much more intense than twice the times. Okay, here the first one to work on that area was Gustav Fechner, and he also discovered kind of a law, and this is the first description of such a nonlinearity in that. And he proposed a logarithmic relation. So what does that mean? In this graph, on the x-axis, we have the stimulus intensity in terms of physical properties. So, for instance, in audition, it would be the decibel, the air pressure. And on the y-axis, we have, they call it here, sensation units. So it's our perceived intensity. So let's suppose we have this stimulus. It has a stimulus intensity of 10 units, let's say 10 decibels, or in light 10 lux or lumen or something. And that results in that sensation unit. So the participants have a scale and they say, okay, that's that intensity. Now, what do I have to do to the physical stimulus to get a doubled perceived intensity? And you can follow this line. You need a tenfold physical intensity. And that's a logarithmic relationship. If one scale has the tenfold increase, the other scale doubles in increase. So for another doubling, you would have to go to 1,000 units to make that. Okay, so that's what Fechner proposed and found out. However, with more and more research, it turned out that this law holds only for some sensory modalities and also only for some intensity ranges. So it's not very universal. And it has been found that there are differences between modalities. So it's not always the same relationship. And this has resulted then in the formulation of which is called Stevens' power law. And the idea is somewhat the same. What we have here in this formula is a physical intensity described by I, the intensity. And we have a perceived intensity. So this is phi of I. And then we say the perceived intensity equals the real intensity to some power. And this is the modality-dependent exponent. So when you have put that into a graph, you can see that these are different values for this alpha, for different modalities. So for brightness, the alpha is 0.33. So we have such a roughly logarithmic shape. For electric shocks, the pain or strength experienced by electric shocks is like 2.5. It looks more like this. So in the early stages, you can increase the strength of the shock quite a bit without having too much change in perception. However, if you go beyond some threshold, even tiny increases in strength of the shock result in very strong increases in perceived discomfort, pain, intensity. And we have loudness here, so acoustic, air pressure to perceived loudness, heaviness, so how heavy do we experience something in relation to the real weight, things like that. And so what we see is, well, it's virtually never linear. You increase it by 10% and you perceive an increase by 10%. So that's important to keep in mind. Here. Okay. I don't know why it comes to my mind. It doesn't fit in here properly. You may know, maybe that is very, very remotely related to that. You may know that children often play this tit for tat. And that often escalates. That, you know, I hit you and you hit back, but that's a slightly stronger hit. And you say, oh, well, you hit me stronger than I did, so you hit back, and that's an even a stronger hit. A couple of years ago, a researcher from London, I forgot his name, very famous guy, I just forgot his name, found out why that is. And the reason is that there's a difference in perception when we receive a hit and when we give a hit. So when you ask the people, they honestly, truly believe they did the same thing to the other person than they received. But they actually do a higher, because there's a disagreement between a passive action, when somebody else touches us, and when we touch ourselves, so to say, because we have kind of account for our own actions in a way so that they don't become too intense and we are flooded by the input of our own actions. So that is an explanation, maybe not totally related, but just came to my mind. Okay, so in scaling, it turned out there is no single perfect law which describes how physical stimuli are scaled towards our perception for every intensity range and every modality. However, Stevens' power law and Fechner's law are among the best ones and most widely used ones. And again, much depends on the actual experimental method, how you do that, the definition of the thresholds, how you define them, and things like that. Okay, to summarize the psychophysics part, here we investigate the relationship between physical stimuli and our perception of that. The absolute threshold is the finding out the lowest detectable intensity of a stimulus. The relative threshold, or just noticeable difference, is the smallest detectable difference between two stimuli. And here we've spoken about Weber's law. And then we spoke about scaling in the end, which is the question of how the physical intensity maps onto the perceived intensity in a nonlinear way, and we have seen Fechner's law and Stevens' law. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, now we will cover the topic of Gestalt theory before we have a little break. Okay, now we go a little bit more complex or higher in the hierarchy of perception. So far we have seen how our physical system works, physiological system works. Then we've seen, okay, very low level, intensity changes, things like that. Now we are going to more coherent figures and organizational principles. And one thing which is still valid today is the results or other results from Gestalt psychology. And if you may remember from last week, it emerged early in the 20th century with a focus in Germany. And it was kind of a different approach to science, what they took. And the usual scientific approach basically is, which is called reductionism. That means if there's something, you have a concept, an idea, a thing to investigate, and if you can break it down into further subparts, then break it down and investigate the smallest possible parts individually. And the advantage of that usually is that you have much better experimental control, it's much easier to find regularities and laws, and so it's not a bad approach. However, Gestalt psychology argued, well, you may miss something here. You may miss the whole picture of things. Sometimes in the whole there is more information than just in the sum of the parts. It's a little bit as if you would have a book and you reduce that to a summary and say, in this book we have 25,000 L's, we have 25,500 M's, and so forth. You lost information here if you reduce it to that amount. So Gestalt psychology advocated the principle of totality. That means one should investigate the whole percept. That means taking into account all parts, specifically not breaking it down, but looking at the whole picture. And for some areas of cognitive psychology, that makes complete sense. One area is perception. Another area, we will see in a later lecture, is problem solving. There again, we need the whole picture often. And the term Gestalt is a German word, and it means basically it's the essence or shape of an entity's complete form. So what does Gestalt psychology do? It provides a description of perceptual principles. We will see in a moment it describes how we perceive things, and it is doing that very good. However, one of the major disadvantages is that it does not explain anything. It just describes but does not explain. There's no model, there's no theory, there's no proposed mechanism or anything like that. In Gestalt psychology, there is one underlying principle, and that is the principle of, again, a German term, Prägnanz. And a translation might be something like pithiness, conciseness, simplicity. And the idea behind that is that when we have sensory input, then our perceptual system always tries to create a percept which is as simple as possible, as stable, regular, and or symmetric as possible. So it tries to make it concise and simple, our perception. It doesn't tend to make it complicated and difficult to understand. We will see examples in a moment where this becomes evident. And many of you will probably know these laws. They are laws or principles of grouping or perception here. So for instance, there's the law of proximity. And in this law, it is stated that objects which are close together form a group. In this example, you will see this is a group of 4, this is a group, and this is a group. These items naturally group together. You have to remember that's from the early 20s, from the last century. It was not self-evident that this is the case. Another example, where we see, okay, and we have even a hierarchical organization here. So in this example, these dots group to a line, these dots group to a line, these dots group to a line. However, on a higher hierarchical representation, all these 12 dots group to a square and perceived differently to these two other square type forms. So you can see that grouping can work on many levels at the same time to group our percept. And this law of proximity is used. Suppose the symbol of Adidas would look like that. That would look very weird, and we wouldn't group that together at all to something. There's a law of similarity, and that states that similar visual elements form a group. Again, very straightforward and easy, and many of us know that from our everyday experience, but it's a very strong law. So immediately we see a pattern of lines, because the black dots group together and the white dots group together. Here it's a similarity in brightness, here it is in color, for instance. We can have similarity in shape. Immediately, virtually all people see lines here of dots, of circles and squares. And we may have more complex shapes, where we have a triangle here of circles, here we have a cross of circles. So similar things are grouped together. We have a law of closure, and that means that we tend to perceive objects as a whole, even if they are not actually complete. This is an example. Most people would immediately say, okay, it's a circle and a square. We just perceive that as a whole thing. You can employ that in art designs, like in this logo, where we automatically have a closure around these borders. These lines are actually not here, but still we have a proper percept. It's used in the IBM logo as well, and we had this in the first lecture as well. Our perceptual system automatically creates new information. And this is another illustration how perception is an active process, and how it is a representation of the surrounding and not an accurate photograph or picture of that. So immediately we get the idea or representation of a circle here. Okay, there's the law of symmetry, and that means that objects which are symmetrical around a center point form a group. And there's a very simple example to that. Most people would perceive that as a group, that as a group, and that as a group. And could put them even further apart. Still a group, still a group, still a group. When you look at that for a bit longer time, we have seen law of symmetry says we group that together. Can you see a conflict here with another law? Proximity, yeah. Because actually, the law of proximity would tell us we should group these two together and these two together, because they are closer together than these. And this shows, again, that our perceptual system tries to get one stable percept. So when we have conflicting principles working, one of the principles is winning. And here, for most people, the symmetry wins. If you make that further and further apart, at some point, you would probably get, if you ask a couple of people, where you have 50% which say, oh no, it's symmetrical around here, and 50% no, it groups according to proximity. So at some point, it would switch over. But for most people, it stays a stable percept. For individual people, usually you can try to actively, and that's the bottom-down influence, switch that. So if I'm at your personal point of distance, where it's like 50% you see that as a group and 50% you see that, you can probably voluntarily switch between, okay, it's either that percept or that percept. So that illustrates the top-down influence which we have on our perception. We have the law of continuity. So we tend to perceive objects as forming smooth, continuous patterns. And that is something which is, of course, sensible in our environment. So when we have a picture like that, most people perceive one line going like this and another line running like that. And most people wouldn't even think of the alternative that we have one line going like that and the other line going like that. For our perceptual system, both should be absolutely equally probable. There's no reason to assume this, prefer this over that, from when we are coming from a pure bottom-up process. However, the law of continuity tells us that we assume that. Again, when we see this, what we see is one cross, and in front of that there's one triangle. What we don't see is, so we see that basically. What we don't see is that. So we could say, okay, we have this as one shape, which is directly attached in here, and then we have this as a weird other shape at the bottom. And this is the principle of pregnance. We try to get the most simple percept for us. And because we are all familiar with triangle and crosses, this is much simpler for us than assuming that. Another example of continuity, our perceptual system, if you look closely, so for most people the perception is, okay, we have one line covered by that. If you look closely, most people will see that there's actually an offset in the lines. But even if you know that, your perceptual system often really jumps back to say, oh no, that is one line. So it really throws away more accurate information from our perceptual system to create this continuous, this wholesome perception. And without that principle, we would be absolutely unable to read graphs and illustrations like that. Because then at every turn we could say, okay, maybe it's running from here down here, and this one is running like that. Could be, but it's not. Okay, and I think it's the last law of figure-ground segregation, and that means when we see something, then we usually structure what we see into two parts. One is the figure, and one is the ground. And the most well-known example of that is the Rubin illusion, where when you see the white as the foreground and the figure and the black as the background, then you see two faces with the nose and the lips, the chin, so slightly tilted back. If you switch and the black is the foreground, then you see a vase and the white is just background. These type of pictures are called bistable percepts. And that means it's stimuli which can be perceived in two different ways. What is intriguing about this figure-ground segregation is we are not able to see it both at the same time. We can switch between them, but it's never possible to see the vase and the faces at the same time. We'll always be jumping back and forth between that. Another illustration of arts by Escher. So here you start at the bottom out with fish, and then you have a smooth transition until you have these ducks in the sky. And again, especially in this area of overlap, of transition, you see either the fish or the duck, but not both at the same time. One is the figure, one is the ground. And then there's, again, a practical example. It's a state route shield, so for a road sign in Idaho, and the white is the shape of the state of Idaho. But a lot of people see here actually a face with the nose and the chin looking down here where it switches back and forth. Okay, so to summarize, Gestalt theory describes the organizing principles that guide our perceptual processes. And the principles we have spoken about is proximity, similarity, closure, symmetry, continuity, and figure-ground segregation. The criticism, as I already mentioned, is that it describes the principles, and it does so very good, but it does not explain why they exist, how they come into place. So it doesn't provide any model or account of perceptual processing. And it doesn't make any reference to depth perception. Okay, any questions regarding Gestalt theory? Okay, then we have a short break and then we go on. let's move on. And we continue with depth perception. So, depth perception refers to our ability to see and perceive three-dimensional, and not only two-dimensional, as we spoke about so far. And that's a pretty important thing to be able to. For instance, in driving, we need to be able to estimate the distance of objects, and that's a problem where children often have problems with, to see, okay, a car is that distance, is that speed, to estimate, can I go there or not? And for a driver as well, to see that there's something in close front. Or generally, we are navigating and interacting in everyday life in a three-dimensional world. So we need three-dimensional information, basically. Okay, so the problem our perceptual system has is that the projection onto our eyes is two-dimensional. It's basically like having two photographs in our eyes. There's, in the first place, that we don't have like a dedicated 3D organ or sensor or something like that. So we have to try to gather information about the distance of object by some other means. So that's the question we will cover here. How can we create a three-dimensional image by two-dimensional images? And there are two types of information which we can employ, or which our brain or cognitive system can employ. One is called binocular cues. That means that we have information from two eyes. And the other one are monocular cues. That means information which basically comes from one or the other eye. Or let's say if you wear an eye patch, you can still use monocular cues, but you can't use binocular cues anymore. Okay, let's now speak about these cues. The first binocular cue is so-called binocular disparity. And that means that our eyes view the world from slightly different angles because they are spatially separate. So this eye looks like this, and the other eye looks like that onto the world. And objects which are further away from us, they have less disparity. Now let's illustrate that. Suppose you as a person stand directly in front of these bowling pins. Then your left eye will look slightly from that angle on the pins, and that eye will slightly look from that angle on the pins. So you have two different views, and you can use that information to get a three-dimensional percept. So what does disparity now mean? And that is, this is a schematic illustration of that situation. You can say these points are different bowling pins, and they have a certain distance. And when you look on the projection onto the retina, they are slightly displaced on the retina. And they are displaced in a way that the thing which is further away is more to the center on both sides. So here it's to the right of the other point, and here it's to the left of the other point. So that's an important information here. Now suppose we have a third bowling pin which is here. That again creates some disparity here. Now this is the same distance. So in space they both, let's say, are 1 meter apart. However, C is closer to B, closer to us than B, and that is closer to us than A in a person perspective. And you may notice that the disparity which is created is quite a bit bigger for C to B than for B to A. That means, in practical terms, that the disparity information is most useful in rather close proximity. For objects rather far away, disparity becomes so small, it's not used by us anymore. So this kind of 3D vision is used only to some extent in our peripersonal space. Afterwards, we can't use it anymore. This binocular disparity, just as a slide aside, is the main cue when you go to 3D movies. And the idea in these 3D movies is that we present different pictures to the left and right eye. And there are different techniques for that. So again, we have this situation, one picture for one eye and the other picture for the other eye, and our brain creates a three-dimensional perception to that. They're not very nice and very old-fashioned and very cheap, like goggles here with two different colors in each side. And the two different pictures our eye is seeing are encoded or presented by a coloring scheme, because they work as a filter. One eye sees only the slightly redder image, the other one only the slightly greener or bluer image. And then we get the two images. A more advanced and modern technique are these shutter glasses, and here the idea is the screen presents the two images one after the other, in an alternating fashion. So left eye, right eye, left eye, right eye, and so forth. And you wear glasses which in synchrony block the view of the right eye or the left eye or the right eye, so that each eye sees only what it's supposed to see to create a three-dimensional image. And hopefully that happens so fast that you don't see that and recognize it, and that it doesn't flicker. Unfortunately, it sometimes does. And the other problem is that the technique is not that advanced that you can fully block the view, so you have sometimes ghost images, because even if that eye is blocked, it can see slightly through these glasses. And a third thing is, and here the disadvantage is that these glasses are a bit more expensive because there's technique involved. You need LCD screens here which are turned on and off, battery and so forth. The last technique is to use polarized light. And you may know that light is an electromagnetic wave, and as such you can, in a simplified way, say, okay, I can do my wave like this, or I can flip it horizontally and do it like that. And you can create glasses which let light only pass if it has a certain polarization, a certain angle. So you project two images at the same time onto the screen, but each image has a different polarization. And then you wear these glasses which filter out the light of one polarization. Advantage is that the glasses are very cheap, because it's only a filter in here, passive glasses. Disadvantage is that you need special screens for that. Otherwise they destroy the polarization of the light. Okay, that's just as a brief excursion to that. So the second binocular cue which we can use is convergence. And that's a pretty simple cue, basically. So you know that children do that sometimes. When you try to look at your nose or a finger pretty much close in front of you, what are your eyes doing? They go inwards like that. And if you are very close, you have to go pretty strong inwards. And if you focus something which is far away, then they don't go that much inwards. So convergence is the information of how our eyes are oriented. And that information comes from the muscles controlling the eyes. And we can use, or we do use, that information to infer about the distance of an object we focus on. Okay, so these are the binocular cues. We need both eyes to use that information. Now we discuss three cues where it is sufficient to have one eye to gather information about depth. And the most simplest one is occlusion. When one object is partly hidden by another object, it must be behind it. So the red one is behind the blue one. And again, the Gestalt principles help us here, because we automatically assume that this is a full square. It could be that it's just an L-shaped figure directly attached to that figure, but we don't assume that in our perception. This is another example, more three-dimensional. And this is a typical land scene view where you see that you have mountains behind mountains. I don't know how, maybe it's a little bit too light here to see that nicely, but you know what I mean. A second cue where one eye is sufficient is the gradient of textures of things in our surrounding, because the texture changes with distance. So, for example, if you have such a brick wall, it's just the size of the elements. Or if you have a pavement, or such a field, an acre or something. And this works even if you have just schematic illustrations. By these things we automatically get a sense or a perception of that we have something three-dimensional where we look into some distance here. So the texture gradient is a very powerful information source as well. The third cue we can use is motion parallax. And as the name suggests, it works only if we move. If we stay still in one place, it doesn't give us any information. And the idea is that when we are moving, objects close to us move faster past us than objects which are distant. So if you're in a moving car, you know that things which are directly next to you, you can't even focus on because they move past so quickly, and things in the far distance move much slower. Or when you're in a train here, it's what is close, it's blurry, which is far away, it's much more in focus. And that information is also used by us. So, to summarize on depth perception, we are able, our cognitive system is able, and very well able, to construct a three-dimensional representation from only using information from two-dimensional images. We have the binocular cues, disparity and convergence, and we have spoken about the monocular cues, occlusion, texture gradient, and motion parallax. Usually, for everyday life, the monocular cues are sufficient. So people who can see only on one eye are still well able to navigate in their surrounding. They can walk around. I think they even can drive a car and things like that. There are only sometimes tricky situations where they may struggle when grasping maybe something, or so when and it's in an unlucky arrangement for them or so. But usually it's really fine to have only one eye. Okay, any questions on depth perception? Okay, then we turn to our last topic for today, and this is object recognition. So we go even one step more abstract or more complex in our perception, from low-level psychophysics to more shapes and how we group simple things, and now to whole objects. And object recognition is a very important thing in our everyday life, because a lot of the time during the day we interact with objects. You have a pen in your hand, you drink your coffee, you do this, you have a laptop, you put on your shoes. It's all objects. We deal with that all the time. So object recognition is really a central purpose of perception. And maybe speaking more in evolutionary terms, one thing we have to find out very quickly is an object harmful? Can I harm myself by touching or using the object? Is it useful? So again, thinking evolutionary, can I use that for something? And if so, how can I use it? How can I utilize it? Okay. So, identification of objects is central for selecting and performing proper actions. Now, today we discuss two theories of object recognition. We've seen Gestalt principles described how certain things are grouped into objects, but didn't explain that. And David Marr proposed a theory of object recognition, and we will see Biedermann's theory, who based his theory very strongly on Marr's idea on that. Okay, so let's speak about Marr's theory of object recognition. And he proposed that the process consists of 3 stages which work bottom up. So from the basic percept to the complex percept. And it starts with a full primal sketch. And to illustrate that, let's have this as an original image. It's a plush rabbit. And the full primal sketch then looks like that. So this is the idea how our cognitive system represents this image. And if you remember last week, cognitive psychologists not necessarily care about biological plausibility. So this is a theory, and in this theory it is not specified whether we really at some stage have a neural representation of this rabbit which looks like that. There is, as it turned out, some overlap, and indeed in terms of neural representation there is some similarity, but it's not necessarily identical. So let's speak about the full primal sketch in some more detail. So the first stage is a full primal sketch, and he said, okay, the image from the retina from this plush rabbit is first transformed into a grayscale representation, basically like that, so color is lost, and then the contours are analyzed. And that is actually what happens really neurally as well. So what he proposed is we analyze that images whether we find borders and edges, and that usually means a steep gradient in brightness. Dark here, bright here. Then we have an edge, and we try to detect that. And then he proposed that using these edges or contours and applying the principles of Gestalt laws, he said tokens are identified. And these tokens are edges, or can be bars, or virtual lines, as in these illusions, can be blobs, like circular shaped things. And this is identified by our system, cognitive system. So we have our original image and then the full primal sketch. Now we have specified our basic features in this image. The next step is what he called a 2.5 or 2.5 dimensional sketch. So we now introduce some information about depth. And that is that for each, so he calls this a range map, which is added to the full primal sketch. And we use for that all the cues we have just described, the monocular and the binocular depth cues. And for the whole surface, this representation contains information or represents the orientation of the surfaces, so that here at the side is probably oriented like that, and the depth, so the distance to us of the surfaces, so that here in the background maybe something is further away than the rabbit itself. This representation is in so-called egocentric coordinates. And egocentric means that we have the representation in terms to we are the center point. If we move, the image moves, and the representation of the rabbit moves. So it's focused on the viewer. It's the viewpoint of the viewer. So we have original image, full primal sketch, 2.5D sketch. And then we have the full three-dimensional model as the third step. It looks like that. I find this representation not very illustrative, but it's the best which I could find. It's actually from the textbook. So, but it's probably hard to describe this and put that into a picture. So now what happens is that the whole object is described in what they called volumetric primitives. We'll see an example of that in a moment. And he assumed that there are only cylinders, so that you describe everything in differently shaped and sized cylinders. And you have a surface to that, which is volumetric. In addition, the representation is now allocentric. That means independent of the viewpoint. Even if we move around, our mental representation stays the same. That's a rabbit which looks like that. No matter from which perspective I watch, my representation is that this is the rabbit. Okay. The advantage of this allocentric representation is that we can memorize objects and compare objects with each other. We are easily able to compare two objects even if we see them from slightly different angle. In egocentric coordinates, that wouldn't be possible. We would say, okay, these are two different objects because they look different. In allocentric representation, we are hierarchically above that, so to say. Okay, so what he thought is, in the last stage, that we describe every object by such a hierarchical organization, and that we use only cylinders for that. So this may be a human shape, and the arm is then broken down into upper arm and lower arm, and then the forearm is broken down into the lower arm and the hand can be broken down into the palm, into the fingers, and so forth. And everything is described by cylinders. And he called that, these are the primitives of describing objects. Okay, so and he had some very good ideas by proposing this theory, but of course some limitations as well. So only using cylinders, it becomes very complicated to describe all different forms. But the general idea of that objects are described or represented in our cognitive system by primitives was quite good, what he proposed. And Irving Biederman then picked up this idea and proposed the recognition by component theory in 1987 and used that. And this is the additional reading, if you want to go into further detail, which is in this folder on BBL. This is his original paper on this theory where he proposed that. So if you want to see how such a theory paper really looks like, how many details are specified and are left open, you could have a look there. And this is considered to be a very, very influential paper in perception or vision sciences in general. It has been cited, I think, thousands of times, actually. So, what does he propose? And we won't go into too much detail with his perceptual stages because they are roughly the same as Marr. Of course, they are more sophisticated and elaborated because he was able to build upon somebody else's work. But one of the main differences is this idea of having primitives. That he said, okay, there are 36 of them, and not only one cylinder. And he called them geons, geometric ions. And he proposed, like Marr, that basically every object can grossly be described by a combination of geons. And he found experimental evidence to support the view that we actually take objects and reduce them to these geons. So, how does it work? And this is just an example. So there are a number of different geons, and these are some of them. And here you can see how different objects are subdivided into these geons and can be constructed by that and represented by that. This is another example of many different things, even like animals and humans can be on a rough scale described by this. Now when we look at that example, what we see is that the same geon is used in different objects. So we can reuse the geons, so to say. It can be a handle of a cup, or it can be a handle of a suitcase. And can also be something completely different, maybe even some kind of bridge or something. So not a handle or so, but generally such a type of shape. And that idea, because he found evidence, behavioral evidence that people actually work like that, was very influential in the way how people thought of how we represent objects neurally in our memory. And at earlier times there have been two competing views of how information is stored. And one is sometimes called the grandmother cell theory, that each object is stored in our memory in a dedicated neuron, or let's say maybe in a couple of neurons. But that basically you have new information, so that's stored in a neuron. This neuron encodes your grandmother. When you see your grandmother or you remember it, that neuron lights up. That was one idea. Of course, this idea has some problems, and that is that then storage is limited by the number of neurons. And the second problem is, or something which seems unreasonable, is that at the beginning of a life as a child, we need a large empty store. So we would have many, many neurons which are just not used. And from evolutionary perspective, we know that everything is tuned towards maximum efficiency. So we don't run around half of our life with 30% of our brain not in use, because it must be supplied by energy, oxygen, everything. That would be a waste of thing. The alternative view is that objects are stored in a distributed way by cell assemblies, so in a network of cells. And that one individual neuron might very well be involved in the memory of different objects when these objects share something. It is this idea of a little bit of like a semantic network which we discussed, that information is spread around. When we want to remember a lion, then we have a whole network of neurons active which encode hair, which encode color, and this hair neuron might be active when we remember a cat or a dog as well, or a human or something. And Biedermann's theory really supported this view. So in that way it was very influential. And by the way, that's a current view, of course, as well, of things. Okay, to summarize the idea on object recognition, we have seen both theories of Marr and Biedermann. And the idea is a little bit like we learned in the organizational principles of our perceptual system, the neural foundation, that it comes in stages. It's hierarchically organized from bottom up, from simple to complex. And that after some initial processing, the objects are encoded as a specific arrangement of these geons, these geometric primitives. Whether it's exactly 36 in the end or not, I think that's not that important. It's the idea that it's important. Okay. Any questions on object recognition? Yes.
Would you be able to bring in face recognition in the exam?
Sorry?
When you're answering a question about object recognition, could you bring in face recognition or Bruce and Young's model?
I don't know how they dealt with face recognition, but they would probably assume that it's a specific arrangement, again, of geometric objects. I don't think that they would say, okay, faces are a specific thing. Of course, we know nowadays from our knowledge from how the brain is organized that we have a pretty large dedicated area in the brain which is specifically working with faces. So the question now is cognitive models of object recognition and the true biological implementation of face recognition. And there we know that for face recognition we are, as humans, fine-tuned to recognize faces, face-like shapes, and we know that certain areas in the brain, for instance, are really active only when we see proper faces. So when you present a picture which is like an oval with just the elements of a face like eyes and nose and mouth in a scrambled fashion, that certain areas of the brain do not respond to that, the highest levels. The lower levels still respond to that, but at some point it breaks to that. So faces are also processed hierarchically in a way. We know that we are fine-tuned to some features like mouth and everything, but at a higher stage we need a proper arrangement of that. Okay, then I would like to conclude with letting you know next week we will speak about attention. And invite you to join the Facebook group. If you want to give a brief feedback on Survey Planet, and hopefully this time it worked better with the recordings on YouTube. And there should also be the recordings from Brunel available on BBL, which is just slides with narration. Okay, thanks for coming. See you next week.